Yeah, I'm dancing in the morning. Hi, Mother.
Good morning, Singapore.
Good morning, Malaysia. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to episode 3 of Love at Work. Okay, so I thought, Mother, we start with a kind of a rundown of what we did this month, right? We chose Love at Work because it's February, it's Valentine's Day. And so let's talk about love, not just bouquets of flowers, but love at work, where we spend a lot of our time. So our first week, who do we speak to? We spoke to Celine, didn't we? And Celine gave us a wonderful, she gave a story about what drives her, and also what drove her to not think about her self-care as well, right? And what lessons she's learned from it. And then last week we spoke to Adi. And Adi blew our minds because not just is he a partner in a professional services firm, he holds a portfolio for human capital for the firm, right? And he's basing his leadership style on the self-care that he found very important as he was developing in the firm and as a leader. So we thought, what did we think? We thought that it would be good to not just hear stories, because the stories are real and they are mind-blowing, because if you ask the right questions, then you uncover some really good nuggets, right? It's also be good for us to know what's the thinking and the science behind what Celine did, what Adi is doing, what other leaders out there are doing as well. Yeah. So we've got someone special for us today, another someone special for us today. Don't be Malar.
Yeah. I thought the right way of introducing our special guest today is saying you hunted him down, because he had a secret code that we were all dying to hear. So
Yeah.
and let's bring
Let's
him.
bring.
Yeah, and
Yes.
get out of him.
So our guest for today is Alain Hunkins from Alain Hunkins Leadership Group, and Alain is not just from a field of leadership. He's written a book called Cracking the Leadership Code. So we want to crack the code with him, right? And he's graciously said yes to us, because why graciously? Because it's 7:00 in the evening, or where he is, right? And we pulled him out from dinner so that he can spend a little bit of time with Malar and me chatting about leadership. Okay. So, Alain, there's so many leadership books out there, right? And you bring another one on board, right? And what made you? What's your purpose? What was it that made you say to yourself, you know what, the world needs this book, and it's an important thing, and I've got something to share.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, first of all, both of you, Malar and Sharm, for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk with you from around the world, from yesterday. It's Wednesday night where I am. I know it's Thursday where you are. And yeah, it's a great question, right? Why another book? So here's the thing. I did not set out to sit down and write a leadership book. This book is actually the distillation of spending literally 20 years in the field working with teams of leaders, literally thousands and thousands of teams over the course of the years. And so instead of like, what's my theory? Let me sketch it on a cocktail napkin and explain
Mm,
this to the world as a prescription. It was more of a sense of I was working with all these leaders and teams and organizations. And what I noticed over time, over, the days and the weeks and the months and the years, is that patterns started to emerge. It turned out that
mm,
all of the best leaders had certain things in common. And so
mm,
did all the lousy ones. They all had certain things in common. And so I was looking for patterns. And what I had noticed is there'd be an example and a story. So I'm like, oh, there's a story, there's an example. Now, what's the data that supports that? So either I'd look at my own cumulative quantitative research or
mm,
qualitative research, and then I'd look at who else is doing stuff and is this supporting what's being said out there? And what I ended up doing is writing all of these different blog posts over the course of 4 years. I had about 250 blog posts. I published one a week, every single week, did not miss a week for over 3 years. So I have
mm,
250 blog posts, and I started reviewing all of them and looking for some common themes. And what I noticed was there were three themes that kept emerging that the best leaders all had in common. And the three themes were, first of all, it was around connection, right? Is understanding. I don't care if you work in manufacturing or high tech or pharmaceuticals, you are in the people business. And so you need to be a student of people, understanding how do people work and how do you connect? Because what is this whole leadership followership? What is that? Ultimately, at its core, it is a relationship. And in this day and age, where we are no longer in the industrial age, where people are, go to the assembly line, put out X number of widgets per hour, just like Frederick Winslow Taylor would say, you should be putting out 2X number of widgets per hour. That makes you a good worker. Now we are in the knowledge worker age where ultimately, if we're going to connect with people, connection is what is going to create the environment for them to succeed. So connection is the first piece. The next piece is around communication. How do we align so that we create common and mutual understanding? And the third piece is around collaboration. So what as a leader am I doing to design an environment where people can perform at their best? And so really the book was written from the grassroots up rather than from the bottom down,
mm,
from all of my experience as a leadership practitioner.
mm. And that's amazing. You've been collecting it over 3 years, right? All you're putting it down and putting a reflection. It's almost like a diary,
Yeah.
diary of work that you're doing. Okay. So I'm going to answer the next question. Connection, communication, and collaboration.
Mhm.
Some would say it's common sense, isn't it?
Some would say, yes. In fact, I would agree with that. In fact, it is very much common sense. However, there's a big difference between common sense and common practice. And so here's a few statistics that,
Mm,
because I'm sure everyone listening right now, in your heart of hearts and in your intention, you mean to be a good leader. And I imagine that you do mean that. But there's a big difference between what we intend and how we are perceived. And as leaders, we're in the relationship business. And it isn't us that is the judge of the quality of the relationship. It is the person who chooses to
mm,
follow us. That
mhm,
is the arbiter. That is the final judge. Well, here are some recent statistics on this. I'll share a few different categories. Let's talk about trust. Right? We could say trust is the glue of relationships. Well, a recent study found that only 49% of global professionals trust their employers. Right? So more than
mm,
half do not trust their employer. When
mm,
it comes to communication, only 31% of people believe that their leaders communicate well. And when it comes to leadership generally overall, only 23% of people believe their leaders lead well. So again, you want to believe you're in that percentage. I must be one of those 23%. Well,
mm,
odds are you're not, right? Or the person next to you, right? 3 out of 4 are poor leaders. And the question becomes why? When it seems that we should know better, this is common sense. If I said to any of you, you need to connect, communicate, and collaborate, you'd go, thank you.
duh.
So for me, and what's in the book and in my work is I want to take a look at, why is this so hard? Because if it was easy, we'd have more better leaders, and we don't. And something that I think is a real key to all of this has to do with the mindset. And I learned this lesson kind of a very strange way. So I mentioned before we came on camera, I have two kids. So my kids, my son Alex is now 17, and my daughter Miranda is 14. Well, this is back about 11 years ago. So they were 6 years old and 3 years old. And the two of them were playing in the living room. And I was in the kitchen trying to get something done. And they were getting very loud, as kids often do. And for whatever reason, I was not having a very good parenting, not a good daddy day. And I got a bit triggered. And I walked into the living room, and literally these were the words that came out of my mouth. I turned to them and I said, "Would you two stop behaving like children?" Right? That's what I said to a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. Now, I'm telling you that for two reasons. Yeah, it's a ridiculously stupid thing to say to a 6-year-old and 3-year-old. But the crazy part of the story is that as soon as I said, "Would you two stop behaving like children?" I went, "Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh." Because those were the exact same words my mom used to use with my brother and I when I was a kid. And so suddenly I was like, oh, I've just basically copied the behavior that I learned unconsciously. It just came out of my, like, and I'm sure if you're a parent, you've had that experience, like, oh, I've become my own parent. So the question I have is, why do we lead the way we do? Even though we know we're supposed to connect, communicate, and collaborate, why is it so often leaders go to the, because I told you, that's why, or some variation? And really what it comes back to is, where did you learn that? You learn that from your leaders, and they learned it from their leaders. And you go back far enough, where you get back to is the beginning of the industrial age and Frederick Winslow Taylor and the birth of the assembly line. And this whole idea that you ever think of the term human resources? Think about that for a second, right? Yeah. It's basically Frederick Winslow Taylor, who's considered the father of the field of management, was a mechanical engineer by training. So he saw this whole organization as a machine with parts. You're like, oh, well, we've got the assembly line, we've got the industry, we've got the heavy equipment, and we have these human resources. And let's just screw one in here, and then we'll unscrew it and screw them up. Oh, yeah, and then you get screwed. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And so what ends up happening is that his thinking caught on, because look, you had people who, you got to remember, in organizations, there's power, there's money, there's hierarchy, there's control, there's ego. And guess what? If you're someone who paid your dues along the way, when you get to that position of power, you're like, I paid my dues. Now it's my turn to take it out on you.
Yeah.
And that all worked just fine until it didn't. And so I write a lot about it. We can talk about that if you want. But yeah, that's where this mindset originated.
It sounds, I paid my dues, now it's your turn. It sounds a little bit like orientation, right? When you get into university and stuff like that. Okay.
Well, it sounds like it sounds like hazing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. I remember, I mean, when I was employed, I was asked many times to be a lead, lead this team and lead that team. And I was like intuitively like, no, right? And no, leave me alone. Let me just do what I need to do. I don't want to lead with the team. But my instinct was, it's too much work.
Yeah.
It's just too much work, right? And maybe it's just easier, and I'm prodding you here. Maybe it's just easier to follow what has happened before, because it's getting us the results, isn't it? It's bringing the results. So why break the mold? Why go fix the wheel when it seems to be working, right?
Well, yes and no. And what I mean by this is that it seems to be too much work. It's because the work of leadership is fundamentally different from the work of being a good doer. And this is the paradox that we see in organization time and time again, which is so many people wind up in formal roles of leadership authority because they were really good doers. Sharm, Malar, you're really great salespeople. So we're going to promote you and make you the sales managers. You're going to lead a team of salespeople. Like, what makes you a good salesperson does not make you a good sales manager. It's a completely different skill set, whether it's sales, I mean, in everything. And so what we tend to do is we rely on our strengths. Like, oh, I was good at this, so I'll just keep doing this. And what we have a hard time is recognizing that it's easier if we shift the focus. So what ends up happening is so many leaders end up wearing this mantle of responsibility. Like, I'm in charge. It's my job to fix everything that's wrong. And somehow clone myself, whereas it used to be just me taking care of myself, which I was pretty good at. But now there's 10 people on my team and I somehow have to make them all into me. It's like, no, you don't. See, this is some of the traps, is recognizing, and I call it the facilitative mindset, is that in the old school leadership, the command and control authoritarian style, it was very much being the commander in chief, right? Because back then, the commander had all the information and they spoon fed it out to people in little, here, this is what you need to do. Let's have a meeting. I'm going to tell you what's going on. Well, in the knowledge work age, everyone has access to information. Information is everywhere. And you as the leader have no more information than anyone on your team necessarily does.
Sure. Yep.
So your role is not to be the commander in chief, but instead to be the facilitator in chief. That is, how do you move information from where it is to where it needs to be? How do you turn and translate that information into insight that people can act on to get better decisions, to get better results? And that is a big shift, because so many of us are just used to that sense of control, that agency of, I know what I'm doing in my competency. And now that I'm stepping into leadership, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. And they're also not comfortable with saying, I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell me this. Flashback 2 years ago. If I had said to you, all right, so we're going to have this global pandemic and everything we know about work is going to get shut down. Do you know how you're going to handle it? No, of course not. And no, neither does anybody else. However, these skills of connection, right? So like that I have these relationships and then communicating, what do we know? What don't we know? What can we do today? What can we do tomorrow? We don't know about next week, but maybe we can focus on what we'll do tomorrow. These things make a difference. And it's a radically different way of leading than it was even 20, 25 years ago.
I don't know is it's the most difficult 3 words in the English language for us to say. I just read it in the guys who wrote Freakonomics, the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a new code, isn't it? It's a new code that needs to be either built or cracked and shared. So Muller's going to go. I know she's waiting to ask a question around that.
I don't know what I'm waiting to ask questions. But I thought you took us through amazing transitions, right, as to how you were thinking about it, and I was most interested in many things, but most interested when you first started and said, we are just patterns, right? And whether we are, so what I'm taking back is that our leadership style has a lot to do with perhaps our unconscious patterns, right? And I suppose that's what you were curious about, to block so much, to look for the unconscious patterns that worked and didn't work, right? And I also love the bit where you said, leadership is not about how good I think I am, but how good people who want to follow me or be with me, in the same path, right? And what is their experience, right? And I definitely loved the idea of evolution that you spoke about, right? Because we know what worked in the past, but have we thought about what works for us currently? And I absolutely loved, when you brought in the idea of how leadership thoughts were formed in the past and how things have evolved, right? But having said that, right, I am just curious. So, do you think that the leadership code that you're talking about and the 3 C's that you're talking about today is relevant in every other organization today? Because I'm looking at the context of surely Malaysia, right? Because I think in Malaysia, we do have a pocket of, young people who are being brought up the way your kids are being brought up. Because there are parts of us who have evolved in our thinking, who are questioning and challenging. But largely, our education system is still pushing for obedience, which means that you don't think, but you just follow. So we do have the follow mindset, right? And we have a couple of mix of young people who come into the workplace, number one. Number two, we have leaders from different generation, again, depending on their mindset, right?
Yeah.
And I think right now, especially post-pandemic, there's this pressure. There's this pressure to be ideal because we are rethinking our purpose. So there's a lot of rethinking going on in that space for everybody, for the leaders and the non-leaders, if you want to call them non-leaders, right? But we're all
Yeah,
leading in some ways because
of course.
we're now thinking, what's my purpose? And I'm now becoming conscious of what I was unconscious of based on what I want in life,
Yeah.
right? So that's happening, right? So if you look at what you have done with leadership code right now, where do you see these things fitting in? Because I think most people, when you speak to them, they want to be the ideal leader to crack the leadership code, be the best
Sure.
version of themselves, and want everybody to be happy followers. But then we have the KPI, right? Where
Yeah.
leaders are being thrown with a lot more outcomes and numbers which are ridiculous with lean, uh, you know,
Yeah.
right, organized. How do we crack all of this, even if we wanted to?
Wow, there's a lot in there. How can we crack all this even if we wanted to? And I want to start with what you ended with, which are on KPIs, right? So the fact is, we can measure many things. And just because we can measure things doesn't mean it's the right thing to be focused on. And let me explain what I mean by this. Basically, if we think about, and I ask leaders this all the time, I say, what are the things that you are accountable for? Right. And what they'll tend to say is the metrics, right? Whatever the numbers are, whether it's revenue, sales, quality, decrease in rent, like they focus on all those things that we're accountable for. And then I'll say, all right, what about the development of your people? What about making sure that they're engaged? Oh yeah, and that too, right? So it doesn't come up because it's not as easily measured, right, as it is like revenue. But what's so interesting about things like revenue and profit and etc., if you think about those metrics, they are merely lagging indicators that reflect the behavior of people. And so why do we, I think in the business world in general, why do we kind of focus on the metrics so much more than the people? Because the metrics are much neater, cleaner, and tidier than people are, right? Human beings are messy by nature. I mean, if I said to the number 8, hey, 8, how are you today? Every single day, 8 is going to say, I'm fine. I'm one more than 7. I'm one less than 9. Every single day, never changes. We know 8 is 8 is 8 is 8. How are you today, Sharm? Well, actually, I've got a sick relative and I'm really not really all these things suddenly, or there's this pandemic going on. I'm whatever, right? So we're a lot messier as people. And so one of the challenges that we have as leaders now, so the question is, if people, like you said, in certain pockets of Malaysia, there's the sense of compliance. Now, that you have to follow the rules. Now, compliance will get you results. The question I think for all of us to consider is, are those results, are we getting those because of our style of leadership or in spite of that style of leadership? Because that compliance will only get you so far. And ultimately, if you have two similar organizations that produce, let's say, similar products or services, and you have one that has kind of, we'll call it the new style of connection, communication, collaboration style leadership, and one that has the kind of old school do as I say because I'm in charge. And if you don't like it, there's 40 other people waiting for your job. Ultimately, if you look at all the different metrics, whether it's around employee productivity, whether it's around company profitability, whether it's about retention, whether it's about workplace engagement, the company that's got the connection, communication, and collaboration will outperform the other one every single time because that's why these principles work. Like if these principles didn't work, we wouldn't be talking about this, but they do in fact work. One of my colleagues wrote this wonderful paper. His name's Tony Schwartz. Wrote a paper that was written up in the New York Times that basically found what's the number one thing that increases employee engagement and retention? It's feeling cared for by your immediate supervisor. Now, if that is not love at work, I don't know what is, right? That is a soft and fuzzy metric, that sense of feeling cared for. And yet, if you flip the question and ask yourself, will you work harder for people that you know care about you, who take a personal interest? I mean, that's a pretty, again, we're back to common sense. I mean, this is how human beings are wired. We developed bodies and brains and hearts and minds in this way because when we lived in small tribes of 100 or 150 people, this is what necessitated survival. It wasn't survival of the individual fittest, it was survival of who's the tribe that can cooperate to create something. And so we have this huge need to belong to whatever tribe or organization we're a part of. So anyway, Malar, I hope that starts to answer some of your question. I mean, it's a huge question that we could probably go off on numerous rabbit holes discussing.
which means that we probably need to do a podcast with you. Right. So now, I like. I think we generally. I'm not sure that I can say we all know what you're talking about
Hmm. Hmm.
at a, you know, conscious level.
Cognitive, yeah,
Yeah,
conscious level.
at a
Yeah.
Yeah.
logical level, all the things that you say, we talk about
Yeah.
engagement here. We
Yeah.
we hear a lot of initiatives around bringing people together,
Yeah.
and we sit in speeches that says people are our greatest asset. You're important for us, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what we say,
Look at it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
we
Yada
say,
yada yada yada. Yeah, exactly. People are our most important asset. Yada yada yada
Yeah,
yada. Yeah.
yeah.
and the practice is different. So we get all of this, but it's all in the air, right? So when you looked at cracking the leadership code, right, was there anything that you found that even though leaders, smart leaders, know this, know the magic formula that the success actually lies within the three C's? I think we know this intuitively.
Yeah.
We know what relationship can do for us because you can answer all the questions really well, which is why
Yeah.
soft skills training don't work, because it works well in classroom, it doesn't work outside. But what do you think is that what has been your experience in your research? What's the greatest fear leaders are experiencing to put into practice what they intuitively know will
Yeah.
bring about the success?
Yeah, great question. So the biggest fear, okay, I'll put it this way around the biggest fear, because you were talking before about, we all know things about engagement. So we talk about employee engagement. We talk about customer engagement. Let's just take that word engagement for a second. The place that most people would have engagement outside of a work context. If I said to you, where do you use the word engagement outside of a work context? What would come up to mind? Where do you talk about engagement?
I would say my kids.
Yeah, but
I was going to, I was
No,
going to
it's
say,
it. Getting married,
yeah,
yeah,
before you get married, you get engaged, right?
engaged. Yeah.
Right? It's like we are now engaged. And what is the promise of an engagement, like in a wedding and a marriage? When you promise someone, hey, will you marry me? We're now engaged. What are you actually saying you're going to do? Think about it for a second. All right.
mm, mm,
I mean, to
Mhm.
me, the answer to that question is what I'm saying is I'm going to spend time with you. In fact, I'm going to spend my whole life with you. That is the promise. Now, it doesn't always work out that way if you look at divorce rates, but that is
Mm.
the promise of the ideal of engagement. I want
mm.
to focus on you and spend time with you. So, what is the number one barrier that I think that leaders face in terms of being able to turn this common sense into common practice? Everyone's so gosh darn busy, right? It's like how many of you as leaders are also trying to get your own other stuff done. And so when you're listening to people, you're not really listening to people because you're trying to kind of get to
Mm.
like check this off your box, right? In terms of these things. We talk about empathy and how important leaders need to have empathy and showing people that you understand them and care how they feel. But the fact is, human beings, to show them that, to engage with them with empathy, you've got to slow down sometimes. And I know I talk with a lot of leaders and say, hey, what do you think about asking your people how they feel at what's going on? And I've had more than one has said, I don't ask my people how they feel. And you want to know
Mm.
why? Because if I ask them, they might tell me. And I don't think I want that much information, right? It's
Mm.
also this sense of, oh my gosh, this messy human is going to overwhelm our work, which is a myth. Now, a lot of people who are in leadership roles don't feel comfortable with the human psychological aspect of people. And so they'd rather let's just focus on the task. Let's focus on the project. Let's focus on the business. However, what you're missing is then you have people who cut themselves off and feel like they can't actually show up. So a few years ago,
Mm.
Deloitte did a study. They found that only about 61% of people feel they need to cover their identities. That is, so 39% of people feel like they can actually show up and be fully themselves at work. And you know how it is. If you show up and you're always having to live with a little bit of fear, putting on a bit of a mask that you can't really be who you are, that can't but help create more disconnection, which creates a lower trust and a lower performance environment. So time is a big one because
Mm.
the fear is that I don't have time to really engage and to invest in my people. And my counter argument to that is, do you have time not to? Right? It's like the old saying that they used to say is like, what if we train our people and they stay? And what if we train our people and they leave us? Well, invest all this money. It's like, what if you don't train them and they stay? Right? So what kind of organization do you want to be? And so it takes a very, I'll call it mature form of leadership to understand these things and actually start to put them into practice. And you said, Malar, going off to a training is not going to cut it. I mean, ultimately, like about 95% of our behaviors are on automatic pilot. They are habits. And so for me, and the work that I'm really excited about now is I'm working with teams and cohorts to actually break the leadership behaviors of, again, leadership is this big mystical concept. Let's break it down into how can you be a better connector, better communicator, better collaborator? What are the skills underneath each of those three things? And let's practice embedding new habits around each one of those to start to develop new habits that make you a more facilitative style leader.
Nice, nice. Sham, I just have one burning question from all he said. Okay,
Oh no.
Burning,
Burn,
burning question.
burn. Okay.
yeah, because I think what you magically said is, I love, the idea of engagement and, being mindful, listening, empathy. So all of the words that you've actually put up, including, how we need to show up, i.e., how do we be authentic at work? How can I bring myself to work and show up as who I am, right? And to bring the best out of me and to be in a calm state, so that I don't feel hijacked. And when I don't feel hijacked, I'm able to be totally be present at work. So I love all of this. And of course, for me, that always connects to emotional intelligence. And we know the hype about EQ and how EQ is important, right? And
Yeah.
so when I run workshops in this part of the world where we talk about EQ, people come to our training because they are sent to our training because they are too emotional, not because they are not emotional.
Mhm.
So people who disconnect don't have to come to EQ training because
Mhm.
they are fine. But leaders who are considered sensitive, connecting with people feel too much, right?
Yeah.
Are seen to be wasting their time. And so that's the myth that we try and break in our class when we
Yeah.
run EQ. But having said that, I'm very curious, we all know EQ is important. How do we form the practice of EQ as a habit at work, from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, well, there's a few things to consider on that one. One thing to consider, if we think about the competencies that form emotional intelligence, it starts with self-awareness. So, first of all, do you know what a feeling feels like in your body? Right? It's not in your head, but it's in your body. So, what does it feel like to be angry?
Mm.
Like, where do you feel it? How do you feel it? Where do you feel? What does sadness feel like? Are you? I mean, there's something like 87 different emotions that need to be expressed, but you can break them down to some basic ones like mad, sad, fear, shame, scared, right? And like start to notice, can you start to identify those things in yourself and notice what's going on? So that's the first piece, is that self-awareness. Then it's that relationship awareness, is like, what is the impact that you're having on others? Can you notice how other people are feeling? And one of the really useful ways to get better at EQ is asking other people for feedback, which is still fairly rare, right? Or people unsolicited say, hey, Sharm, I would like to be a better leader. What are
Mm.
some things that I do well? What are some things I could be doing even better? And really being open to that. And when Sharm gives me the feedback, my job is to basically say, shut up and thank you. I don't say shut up. I said it to myself. Shut up, Alain. Don't butt in. And then when you're done, say thank you. So a big piece of cultivating emotional intelligence is starting to recognize how are things playing out. Another piece that I'd share that I think is particularly useful these days, in the middle of this pandemic and beyond, is just checking in with your team, and having this become a structured thing, so it doesn't just happen out of the blue. Like, why are you asking me how I feel? Like, what's wrong? Am I about to get fired? Like, but
Mm.
instead to actually on a regular basis start checking with your team with a few questions that don't take a long time to answer. The first question is, how are you feeling? And you can't say fine, how are you? Because fine is just a cultural placeholder for other things. So how are you feeling? And then what's on your mind, or what's distracting you? And how can I support you? So those three questions go a long way towards creating more psychological safety and building trust and candor. And obviously, one of the key things to this too is that leaders need to model. Like, if you want people to model honesty and vulnerability, you have to model honesty and vulnerability. So that's why
Mm.
the leadership role is one that takes courage, because people will only share as much as a leader is willing to model for them.
Mm. Hmm.
I loved the bit about modeling, and
Modeling, yeah.
that's how
Yeah.
much people can. That's so good. Okay, I
I'm
have
I'm
two
gonna
questions.
I'm gonna take, yeah, I'm gonna take takes
Taking
away
back.
your right for the next question. I'm grabbing it. Okay. So I'm going back to Sham 20 years ago, and when Sham was told, why don't you take the leadership position? And Sham said,
Hmm.
run away, go
Yeah.
away, leave
Yeah.
me alone, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I'm sure no, thinking back, was it, a lack of confidence in my skill as being a leader, or not knowing what it means to being a leader, or um, not even, or even thinking that leadership is just too much work, right? It could be any of those, right? And I'm thinking about all those people out there who are not yet leaders but are considering want to be a leader, and yet hesitant because they see models that are not really good models.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Sure.
And if I'm one of those, right, and I'm asking myself, what do I need to build, how do I need to be, in for the rest inside of me, how do I need to be in order to be a good leader? Because I've seen bad ones, I don't want to be a bad one, right?
Yeah.
What would you say to Sham 20 years ago?
Well, I think there's one thing that Charm 20 years ago probably is feeling 20 years ago, but you didn't necessarily express, which is
Mm,
why you didn't want to step into leadership. What was the resistance? And like you said, Charm 20 years ago saw a lot of bad leaders. And here's the thing, when we see leaders around us, we cast judgment around them. I use an
mm,
analogy sometimes that as leaders, we wear a target on our back, right? And if we are bad leaders, people talk about it. Oh, Charm, can you believe what a crappy leader she is? And you know that because you've done that to other people. And
mm,
so part of it is the fear of the feedback, whether it's straight to your face or behind your back. It's the judgment of what people are going to think about you. And, I remember I had a leadership coach because I remember feeling some of the same fear around like stepping into stuff. Because look, as soon as you step into the middle and say, hey, here's my vision, follow me, someone's going to say, screw you. I don't agree with that. Or,
mm,
you're going to suddenly have to deal with that. But as one of my mentors said to me, no one ever built a statue to a critic, right? So the fact is, there's a wonderful, I don't know the whole thing, but you might have heard it. Theodore Roosevelt once wrote years ago about the man in the arena. Today we call it the
mm,
person. But the idea is that you have to be out there. If you're not out there in the arena doing it, all you are is on the sidelines watching, right? And you're going to follow somebody else's lead. And so I think for the Charm 20 years ago is recognizing, you know what, this is a stretch because the fact is leadership development, you growing as a leader is you growing as a person. You can't
mm,
separate the two out. And so for me, it becomes what's the opportunity? And if I don't take on this opportunity to lead, to stretch myself, because what is leadership ultimately, right? What it is at its simplest, leadership is about trying to get people to get something done. That's it. That's influence, right? If you
mm,
think about
mm,
it, what we're trying to do is work with others. And sometimes it's just leading ourselves. Sometimes my biggest leadership challenge is to me get out of bed in the morning and do what I say I'm going to do with nobody else, right? I've got this task list, I've got my project
yep.
plan. And it's like, oh, I'd rather not do that today. I'd rather call a friend or go for a walk or, surf the
Mm,
internet for a while. And that's like, okay, so that's my own stuff I have to work through. So I think I would I would counsel Charm from 20 years ago is say, you know, the magic happens when you step in and say yes and try it and then
mm,
keep working at it. It's not a straight line, In fact, it's more like a cha-cha, right? Two steps, like that dance, two steps forward, a step back. You're constantly having to work through this, and that the progress is what creates. Progress comes from the practice, and so it's
mm,
important to keep practicing these skills. And I think all of us need to learn how to better connect, communicate, and collaborate. That is a lifetime endeavor. I
yeah.
remember talking with a friend of mine's father. So for a colleague of mine, her father had started as a salesperson for a multinational food company, and he'd worked his way up. He became the CEO of basically one of their country heads. He became the CEO of the country head, which was a multi-billion-dollar business. And I remember saying to him one day, I said, "So, what was the day that you feel like you arrived and you can just like let things slide,
Mm,
like
mm,
work off your momentum?" And he stopped. He laughed at me. He said, let things slide, like arrived. It's like,
mm,
when you stop working at this, the day you retire is when you get to hang it up. But until
mm,
then, you have to prove yourself every day. Much like they say about, athletes, you're only as good
Mm,
as your last game. I think
mm,
every single day as a leader, we have to realize that there's a canvas and we're painting on it every single day. And what is it we're painting? Because we'll be judged by somebody that day. So it's
mm.
yeah, that's so those are my words of wisdom to 20-year-old
Sham,
Sharm
20 years ago, not 20 years ago.
20 years ago. Exactly. Exactly.
um, Progress comes with practice, right? And I think
Yeah.
progress also comes with when you, like you said, the cha-cha, two steps forward, one step back.
Yeah.
Mistakes will happen, and I think being comfortable making the mistakes, or being in
Yeah.
your skin, comfortable in your skin making those mistakes, is part
Yeah.
of building maturity, right? Your maturity as an individual, your maturity as a individual contributor,
Sure.
as a leader, right? And Malar, you mentioned that you've got a question on maturity that you wanted to ask.
Yeah. So I realized I didn't ask a question among the many questions I had for you.
Okay.
But it's
Okay.
like burning now because of Sham. So, I mean, you did talk about maturity and all the things that you said makes a great leader, who's able to be present, being mindful, has a lot to do with our level of maturity, right?
Mhm.
And we have more and more young leaders emerging
Yeah.
because they sound matured,
Hmm.
right? Intellectually, cognitively, they're able to put out a lot of thoughts in the right way,
Hmm.
right? Now, so how do we, so if we are choosing leaders, what would be, oh, first and foremost, maybe I should ask you whether you agree that we continue to mature along the way, and maturity is different at different points of time in our life. Like Sham 20 years ago and Sham now, right? Because we mature with time, with
Yeah. Hopefully, I'd say yes, and my answer to your question on this one is yes and no,
yeah.
which is I don't think that time in and of itself leads to maturity. I'm sure you've
Okay.
had the experience of working with some people who have 20 years of experience, and there are other people who have
Yes.
1 year of experience 20 times, right? Because the question
Nice.
is, you don't learn just from experience. You learn from experience that you reflect on, go,
Mm,
what happened? What worked well? What could I basically experience becomes a teacher if you see it as a tool for feedback.
Nice.
yeah.
However, if you only go like, well, I deserve this because I've been here 15 years longer than anybody else, like, what is your benchmark? Your benchmark is time on a clock, you know?
Hmm.
I mean, the only thing you get on time on a clock is a birthday cake. I mean, everything else is a bit earned, right? So,
Yeah.
that's why I say yes and no. So I think
Nice.
maturity is a combination of experience plus reflection and then application of that reflection.
Mm,
Nice. So how do we, because I find that when we bring young leaders on board, just because they're able to express their thinking in a matured way,
Hmm.
we expect them to make choices, decision, especially when it comes to stuff that involves experience. Some things, while you say we need to reflect, but we need some time to gain that experience in life, so that we
Yeah.
can reflect then and make it
Yes.
into our leadership insight, right?
Hmm.
So how would you? What's the advice you would give to young leaders about maturity? How to be the that have the right level of maturity for different in different spaces or age.
or how to
As,
think about the levels of maturity
yeah,
at different
yeah, because
spaces. Yeah.
I think what we do is that the moment someone is put in a position of leadership,
Hmm.
even if you're a 30-year-old, we sometimes expect and when I say mature, assuming they're really mature, that they have the maturity of the 40 or the 50 or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Because of the
Yeah.
number of years. So that can be really hard on young leaders who really are doing very well for their age, sometimes
Yeah.
better, right? But we tend to throw this on them. So what is your advice for them?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd kind of caution against, there's a tendency, also some ageism here, right? The fact is,
Yep.
you have some really mature young people who just
Mm,
happen to be, again, personality wise. And I think when we think about maturity, really at its core, I'm thinking of in my own journey, and I was one of those people I was an old man when I was 5 years old for a whole host of reasons, which we can go into if you want.
yeah.
But I was one of those old souls. Like, I was thinking about deep things and concerned about things as a kid instead of being a kid. And as I think about kind of the process of maturation, I can point to a couple of moments, particularly the birth of my children, particularly the birth of my first child, was
Mm,
a huge accelerant on the maturity spectrum. And I think
mm,
here's the lesson that I learned then, which I think is completely applicable in leadership, is I remember holding my son, kind of getting home from the hospital after I cannot believe they just let us walk out of here with him. Like, don't you need to have some kind of permit? That sense of, are we qualified to be parents? As
yeah.
many new parents feel like, I don't know what I'm doing. But what I realized, what that experience taught me was I am not at the center of the universe. Like until then, I was sort of me, ego in the center, and everything revolved around that. And then the cosmic joke of all of that was, wow, I realized I had never been in the center all along. And this other being, I needed this other being to show that to me. It's like,
Mm,
because if your child is screaming in the middle of the night, it doesn't care that it woke you up. It doesn't care. And you don't go, don't you realize it's 2 a.m? It's
good
like,
morning.
no, this is you or whatever. You do what you need to do because you love this being, because you realize it is not about you anymore. And I think so. I say all that because I think about this idea of leadership maturity. The
Mm,
sooner that people can grasp that leadership is not about you, even though because you're like, but I'm the leader. Like what? Like so what? I mean, the point is you succeed if those you're leading succeed. So how
mm,
can you turn the
mm,
flashlight instead of putting it on you? Is use this platform to help those around you, right? As one of my coachees once said to me, I see my role, I'm a bulldozer, because what I try to do is clear the path out of the way so that all of the people that I lead, they can walk smoothly, right? And I think that's a really good analogy for it. So
mm.
I'd start with this sense of what can you do so it's not about you, right? Understand this is not about you. So when you show up to a meeting, don't show up trying to dazzle people with your intellect. Your intellect is fine. You already have the job. So what can you do to listen and draw other people in, right? And so that is part of the maturity path that I think some people get quicker than others.
Mm.
Thanks.
Oh,
Nice.
wow. Oh, nice. Very, very nice. So, Alain, if I were to ask you, what would be one code that you would leave for us as a summary of today's chat? What would it be?
Wow. I think we've talked on a couple of the themes that I think are big ones. Number one,
Mm,
it's not about you, right? So the more that you can frame leadership as an act of service and an act
mhm,
of love, right? Going back to our theme for this episode, right? And realizing is, do you care about those people? Do you love them enough to want them to succeed? Much in the same way that you would hope to like love your child, that they would excel beyond your own expectations. So the
mm.
first thing is it's not about you. And the other thing I would say is that people are good at many, many things, but reading your mind is not one of them. So if you want someone to do something or expect something, please tell them. Don't expect them to somehow intuitively know it, because they don't, and neither do you. So be okay. What I like to say is that what great leaders do is they make their implicit assumptions explicit. So don't make people into mind readers. It's not about you, and seek out feedback. That's the third thing, is just reach out for feedback, because like we said earlier, you have great intentions, but the people you lead are not you. So the only way to find out if your intentions are landing is to ask them and get feedback on how it's really showing up.
Mm, great. Thank you, Alain.
Sure.
Thanks for sharing these nuggets with us. And I'm
Yeah.
sure many in the audience are going to, want to know a little bit more and know where do we go and look for, these nuggets, more of these nuggets. So can you point us in the right direction?
I
Where do
can
we go?
point you. I will point you to this. It's not. It's a real book. See, folks, it's not just a screensaver. It's not my virtual background. So yeah, Cracking Leadership Code. If you want to learn more about, so there's my name. It's alainhunkins.com. Okay, go to my website. You can actually download the first chapter of the book there. There's also a free ebook called Navigating Trust. You can download from there. I have a newsletter you can subscribe to. I mentioned this thing about habit formation. I run a 30-day leadership challenge that is open to the public 3 times a year. So depending on when this airs, usually it's January, May, and September. We usually run that for 30 days with a cohort from literally around the world.
Mm.
We just finished our last cohort. We had people from Ghana, from Australia, from Switzerland, from Germany, from France, from all over the place. So yes, AlainHunkins.com. You found it there. So yeah, reach out to me, connect with me on LinkedIn. That is my social media of choice. You can either connect with me or follow there. And yeah, if I can be of any service to you and or your teams or organizations, please do reach out.
Very good. That's where I hunted him down, LinkedIn.
She found me on LinkedIn. Yeah, I'm pretty active there. So
There we go. Thank you so much for being with us, Alain.
oh,
And I'm going to pass it on to Malar. Malar?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
thank,
Thank you. Really nice meeting you. I'm glad Sham is a hunter and she's a very good one.
yeah,
And
thank you.
thanks for saying yes. And so many leadership nuggets that you gave us.
Yeah.
I think there were so many codes that you help us crack within the big code that you have. I can't wait to get your book and read it. And then, I will use it as an excuse to hunt you back down.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. You have a beautiful day and thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
Thank you. Have a great Thursday. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay. Oh, wow. That was
I have 4 pages of written
notes, right? Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
the
I
most
didn't know
I
I
ever
should, I
4
should be.
pages of this.
Yeah. I was trying to see how I could write notes without looking like I was writing notes.
Oh.
You know what I mean? Right. So
I will use his wisdom to say I just showed up and this is who I am. So I needed to write because it was too good for me not to write it. So yeah, that was
very
good.
good.
So
Okay.
Sham, thanks. Good job this week getting him here. So
Yeah.
now we need to up the game next week.
Yeah. And next week is we start March, and March has a different theme. So look out for it. We've got an interesting lineup of people and things that we're going to do a little bit differently in March. Right. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. Hope you had a good time. I hope you got the nuggets that, not just Malar and I did, but more than that. And you know where to find Alain. So see you next week. Same time, same place.
Take care. Bye. This is Mara signing off from Malaysia. Hearts and Minds. Bye.
Bye-bye.